Imani?
Yeah. Yes.
Shall we?
Yes.
We can, eh?
Yeah.
Nianze kurekodi. Nianze kurekodi. All right, so good morning, guys, and Happy New Year. We hope all of you have started the year on a high, and we at the IEA appreciate that you are all here, and we are glad to see some familiar faces and some new faces. So for those who are joining us for the first time and are interacting as well with the IEA for the first time, the Institute of Economic Affairs is a public policy think tank based in Nairobi, Kenya. And what we do is we conduct research and use our research findings to convene policy dialogues and discourses as the one we are having this morning. So this is our webinar number 1 of 2026, and we will be having more of these conversations in the coming days. So a bit of housekeeping. You notice that your cameras are on mute, are off, and your microphones are on mute. And this will be all through the presenter sessions where my colleagues and I will be making the presentations. After which, during the plenary, you will be unmuted and you will have an opportunity to ask questions or give your comments. But in the process of the conversation, if you feel you have a question that you might forget by the end of the meeting, please feel free to use the chat box, type in your question. My colleagues and I will have a look at it. And during the plenary session, we will have an opportunity to respond. So that's just about it for the housekeeping. So back to our meeting this morning, or our agenda for this morning. So the conversation we are having this morning is the state of global order in 2026. And just to outline what we will be doing, we will be taking you through a clear the objective of this meeting, after which we'll take you through a clear definition of what global order is. After that, we will give you a current reality of the global order. And then after the current reality, we'll go to the consequences. After the consequences, we'll have the conclusions and then the plenary session. So without going too much into that, our objective for this morning, the next slide kindly, Manuel. Our objective this morning is to examine the state of global order in 2026, look at the implications for economic governance, development policy, and global institutional capacity. And this is largely building on IEA's tracking of global events, which have clearly pointed us to an order that is actually in flux. So the IEA is in its second year of implementing its new strategic plan. And while we were working on this strategic plan, we looked at the work that we have been doing at the Institute. And part of it entailed tracking global activities and global happenings. And because of that, of the 6 antecedents that we came up with, which are the foundations and pillars of the work we will be doing over the next 5 years, we realized that the global order is actually in flux. So one of our antecedents is a global order that is in flux of a determination that we made. So having understood that, we hope that at the end of our presentation, you will be able to gain more insights on what really a global order that is in flux means and what the implications have been up until 2025 end. Now we're in 2026. You'll be able to understand what the changes we have been experiencing for the globe have actually meant for global players, regional, and we bring it back home to a local perspective. So let's dive into understanding what global order is. The next slide. So what we are saying at the Institute of Economic Affairs is that global order is an outcome. It is an outcome and it is not really a fixed structure per se. And it emerges when it emerges from the interactions between state actors and non-state actors. And it is not, and this interaction is through both formal and informal mechanisms that govern global behavior. So when we're speaking about state actors, we are looking at governments, intergovernmental bodies, international bodies. And when you're speaking about non-state actors, we are looking at multinational corporations and private entities who, in our view, together shape how power is exercised and how decisions are made globally. So when we look at how the formal mechanisms that come to play, we are looking at them in terms of the rules and regulations, which include treaties, international laws, and international institutions like the UN, the WTO, the IMF, and all these international bodies. Sorry. And when we're looking at the informal mechanisms, we're looking at the norms, the customs and power dynamics that play out during these interactions. So the key point that you should be taking off this is that global order is very dynamic. And this reflects in who holds power, how corporations are managed, and how conflicts are resolved at any given time. So now that we understand what global order really is, we now ask ourselves, why does it really matter? And global order matters because it directly affects countries and global actors and how they interact, and also determines whether we move towards possible cooperations, which entails predictability, fairness, or we are moving towards a more fragmented and conflict-driven order. But most importantly, for this discussion, we want you to have at the back of your mind that the global order shapes the provision of global public goods. So without the framework, or rather without a shared framework, then we have countries struggling to coordinate on issues such as climate change, pandemics, peace, and financial stability, all of which form part of global public goods. So in the end, you will notice, as my colleagues will be making their presentation, that global order influences how a lot of things happen in the globe, from trade to financial activities, to security, and eventually all these come up and have a way of affecting or impacting the development outcomes. So why global order matters is because we believe at the Institute of Economic Affairs, and as the evidence will be pointing out, that a stable order lowers uncertainty, and from the trade perspective, there will be elements of lower transaction costs because of an understanding. But if you look at it from a point of a weakened global order, then you notice there is increased volatility, increased risks like we have seen, increased inequality, and particularly, as you will be seeing, as my colleague Emmanuel will be making his presentation, for the developing countries. So now you've had me speaking about global public goods. Let's now unpack to you what these global public goods are. So we know that public goods are defined by two characteristics. They are non-excludable on one hand and non-rivalrous on another end. So that the two key characteristics also apply when we are defining global public goods. So global public goods are defined as non-rivalrous and non-excludable. This means that no country can be excluded from their benefits, and one country's use does not reduce the goods availability for use by another. And when you're speaking global public goods, we focus on the word global, and we are saying that benefits extend beyond national borders and are very essential when you're speaking global human welfare and global prosperity. And so just to give a few examples for better understanding, when you're speaking global public goods, we can have conversations around global public health, and we'll take you back to what happened with COVID-19. Remember, the vaccine was actually became a public good, and it meant that Uganda using it did not mean that Kenya would not have an opportunity to use it, for example. And then when you look at climate stability as well, when we are fighting or when countries come together and are having conversations about clean air, it will not only benefit Kenya, for example, it will benefit everybody across the globe that we have proper clean air. And then when you're speaking about peace and security, if you look at the Russian invasion in Ukraine, you notice that that war did not only affect Russia and Ukraine. It had ripple effects, and different countries across the globe actually had an impact of that war. And when we are speaking peace and security, when a border is safe, it does not only benefit the country whose borders are safe, it also benefits all the other countries that border it, and even those that don't border it, when you're speaking trade and other indicators. So very quickly, we also look at just to conclude an understanding of the public goods. We are saying that because these goods benefit everyone, no single country has the sufficient incentive to provide it. One country cannot provide it alone. And that is why the global order is important, so that it allows for interactions between different countries who will then come together and ensure that the global goods are actually provided. So a proper or a safe or an ideal global order will allow for countries to create collective actions to problems and also allow for global coordination for solutions. And if you look at this, it all links back to how orderly our globe is. So in a nutshell, that is just to give you the insights on what global orders are, what a global order is, and why it is important, and focus on the fact that the provision of global public goods fully lies on how well we work towards ensuring an ideal global order. So my colleague then, Emmanuel, is coming in to just take us through and help us understand the current reality of the global order so that we are on the same page on whether or not the global order is actually in flux. So Emmanuel, please, you have 15 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you. So now, what's actually happening around the world, right? So Winnie has told us the global order is whatever it is that's going on when you step into the world at that moment or in that period. So we can look at the global order through, different facets of human activity. We have our institutions, the institutions that we have and the way they work. We talked about these as formal mechanisms of the global order. You also have all manner of informal mechanisms, the norms, right? This is how we do things in this world. We can look at how strong our institutions are, both at or at three levels, right? At the local level, at the regional level, at the global level. So we're saying that humans have organized their activities domestically and globally in terms of the commercial exchanges they make, that's the economics. They've organized their activities in terms of the institutions, which are the rules that they agree to follow as they interact. We can look at human activities in terms of the socio-political actions and reactions, right? And all these factors actually shape each other. We can also look at the technology and the way that that shapes the reality that we experience. And we can look at the outcomes, right? What conditions these human beings are actually living under. So, for example, one dimension of these conditions is peace. How peaceful are the relations between human beings? We could also say how poor or rich these humans are. So, let's get into it. Peace. So, in peace studies, peace has positive and negative components. The reason we care about peace is because we're asking ourselves, how do we get to a world of prosperity, whether we're Kenyans, Africans, or citizens of the world? So peace, you can look at peace as the absence of violence or absence of fear of violence. So that is negative peace. Or positive peace denotes the presence of systems that sustain peace. So what's the difference? This is the difference between you have a country where it's at war, and you bring in instruments of force to stop the conflict. That is negative peace, right? In a nutshell. Positive peace is what else do you do in addition to that? It's not enough to just stop the fighting. You need healthcare, education, etc. So here we have the negative index of negative peace. So this is the global peace index. How peaceful is the world right now? The first and most important thing that I would like you to take away from the findings of the global peace index is that when we look at all the indicators of peace, specifically negative peace, they are higher than they've ever been since the Second World War, right? So when you look at all of human history since 1945, we are more volatile. We're experiencing more volatility now than we have since that period, right? So this is measured by in terms of uh, how militarized the world is, people's perception of peace, and then how much violence there actually is. So external conflicts, you have a deterioration between 2024 and 2025. Deaths from internal conflict have also been increasing. Military expenditures as a share of GDP. The number of refugees has increased year on year. And overall, since COVID, we've actually seen a a permanent deterioration in the state of peace. Now, what about positive peace? If you're running a country or you're the citizen of a country, when the violence stops and the guns stop shooting and the tanks stop running around, what you're interested in is the question of whether the environment is actually conducive to living, right? And what do you do when you live? You trade, you buy and sell stuff, you have your house, you do basically the things that you want to do according to how much utility you get out of them. You're just trying to live your life as a citizen. So globally, then you have positive, whereas negative peace is short term and medium term. Positive peace are the conditions that ensure that peace is a long term reality. So over the past 10 years, right, 5 out of the 8 pillars have actually improved. So free flow of information, it's been determined is important for peace. The equitable distribution of resources, it has been determined, right, empirically, is important for peace. That means that can people actually access, like, for example, socioeconomic mobility, is that a reality in a given geographic space? The acceptance of the rights of others, human levels of human capital. So all these factors have actually been improving, except for good relations with neighbors, well-functioning governments, and corruption. So corruption has actually been increasing at the global scale. When you take all the governments and put them all in a box together, in total, governments have been functioning less well, and states have been, neighboring nations, neighboring states. Sometimes both nation states have actually seen their relations deteriorate. Now, the world is less peaceful. But what about the world's ability to respond to these changing conditions? So the index, the Fragile State Index, is one very good instrument to sort of help us make sense about whether the world's institutions are actually ready to how they're responding to this reality, what capacity they have to respond to this reality. So the Fragile State Index actually measures the cohesion within a nation state, the distribution of resources within that nation state, the political legitimacy of the state. Like, do people believe that this state is legitimate? And all this put together tells us how well that state is responding to the stresses that it is facing in the present moment. So when you look at this chart before us, you can see that the very blue countries labeled in very blue are have states that are very sustainable. That means this is telling us that right now, given all the stresses that these countries are facing right now, and right now being 2024, right, in that time, the recent past, these states are, how well are they responding to those stresses? So the states in the darkest blue are their ability to respond is graded sustainable, right? They get an A plus in this class. But then the countries are colored in oranges and red. Well, what this is telling us is these states, their governments, the institutions are stressed out, right? They are facing a lot of stress and they're not responding to this stress very well. That's why they are fragile. So if they if they continue to face stress, the index doesn't tell us when, right, these states will collapse. It doesn't predict that. It doesn't tell us that if one indicator hits this tipping point, then the state will collapse. Rather, it tells us that there's all these stresses coming from different directions, different vectors, and they're meeting the state where it is at this moment. And the state is either responding effectively to these stresses or it's not. So then if it faces more stresses in the future, then it's not going to cope with them well. And you can see the African continent has a high concentration of fragile states. The East African community is not home to the most stable states in the world. Southern Africa has more stable states, but South Africa itself is at the warning. Namibia and Botswana are a bit more green. Kenya is a bit orange, but the worst performer in the world actually comes from the East African community, and that is Somalia. Then you have South Sudan and DRC, right? So Somalia came number 1. The DRC came number 3. The score is out of 120. So you can see Somalia's score of 111.3 out of 120 is pretty poor. And that's the worst score in the world. Freedom. Now, we've seen that the world is less peaceful than it was, it's becoming less peaceful. We've seen that some states will be more able to be effective to effectively respond to all the stresses that the world is producing. But now, what about human freedom? Human freedom brings us to the kind of life that individuals are living. This is measured by the Human Freedom Index. So empirical findings tell us that 76% of the world's people live in the bottom half of countries as ranked by freedom. And 90% of the world's population lived in countries where freedoms have declined since just before COVID to the present day. So freedoms include political freedoms, economic freedoms. It's telling us that can you associate with who you want? Okay, so one question might be, why should I care about human freedom? So where does prosperity come from? Prosperity comes from, if we talk specifically about prosperity in an economic sense, right, as measured by per capita incomes, that is highly correlated with the intensity of knowledge in a geographic space. So if we have a lot of smart people in some, in one county, and then the other county has no one equal measure, well, that one county with very, maybe they've got a lot of engineers and they're working in a factory somewhere and scientists and, maybe some lawyers and accountants to help them do their when they do all their science and their engineering stuff, they need someone to come and tell them what's going on with the accounts. But the bottom line is this: empirically, when people are free, they will pursue some sort of a shared interest, and they want to build something very, very complicated, like a Lexus vehicle. You need to be free to do that. You need to be in a geography of peace to do that. And you need to be in a geography where if something happens, there's a disruption in life, the state can respond to bring things back to stability. So what do you see here? The wealthiest nations are also the freest. They're also the ones with the most effective states. Now, what we have before us is a chart showing planetary boundaries. This chart is basically telling us that even as wealthy countries do well on their own and poor countries do very poorly on their own, we live on a planet, a shared planet, and this planet's ecosystem, the climate systems and the systems of the environment actually are deteriorating, and you need to cooperate in order to bring them back to proper functioning. Here you can see that the world's concentration of poverty is on the African continent has a very high concentration of poverty as measured by the poverty headcount ratio, right? So this is by the year 2024, a lot of the world's poorest people were on the African continent. So while the poorest people were on the African continent, Africa barely participates in global trade. The East African community took up in 2023 just 0.23% of global trade, right? That's just about 50 billion in exports, right, on the export side. Whereas China, the United States, and Germany were the most important participants in global trade. What does this mean? How do you make sense of this? This is telling us that even as the world teeters on talking about fragmentation and multipolarity, the wealthiest nations have benefited a lot from being interconnected. All these countries are selling and buying to each other. So there's a large responsibility for them to steward the global order. Disruptions will be costly for who? Especially for the little guy in the wealthy countries and the little guy in the poorest countries. Then if they should care, then small open economies that are price takers at the global level should care that much more about the global order. And in fact, multilateralism, right, putting institutions together at the global level might be a preferred path. Now here we have the global exports. So in 2023, the world's GDP was just about 100 trillion, and 22 trillion, right, was the value of global trade. 1.27 trillion was the value of trade in crude petroleum. 838 billion was the value of the trade in integrated circuits. Why do I highlight crude petroleum and integrated circuits? Because we are going through a transition in human civilization where human civilization has previously been defined by our consumption of petroleum products. It's now being increasingly defined by the semiconductor chip. Now, the semiconductor chip is important because it is at the bottom of the architecture of everything technology. Not only is it's these chips are everywhere. You look around you right now. If you're tuned into this webinar, you are consuming semiconductor chips because they're in your computer and on your smartphone. So, in all, the state of the world is this. On the one hand, we need each other much more than ever, right? The African continent specifically, as poor as it is, has been benefiting from improvements in productivity elsewhere across the world. So even though we're poor, because someone else has engaged themselves in being highly productive and they've lived in states that are very stable, states that are very free, people on the African continent can enjoy things like the consumer products that we are consuming and using even at this very moment. And you can see before you that even when it comes to the cutting edge of technology, it is wealthy, free countries that are leading the charge. So, in all, even though the world is less peaceful, small, poor, open economies should be pursuing domestically more freedom and globally multilateralism. I will leave it now to my colleague Vivian to tell us what this all means.
Okay, thank you very much, Emmanuel. Thank you for taking us through the realities, and we have seen indeed that the world is heading towards fragmentation. We have seen the fragility, the peace, how it is reducing over time. And now I'll take you through the section of the consequences. What are the consequences of these realities that Emmanuel has been able to take us through? So under the consequences, we classified them into 3 levels. We have the global level, the regional level, and the local level. That is on the first column. Then under the global level, we'll be able to identify what are the consequences at the institution, economic and political, then social consequences. So I'll just give you a summary of these consequences, try to explain what their implications are. So I'll go per row. So we have the global consequences. So at the institution level, we are able to note that there is declining effectiveness of global institutions. So we are able to see global institutions still exist, they still exist, but they're increasingly unable to enforce or solve some major global problems. And we are able to remember what happened during COVID-19, how it was very difficult for global institutions such as World Health Organization to come up with a solution when it comes to that crisis. And if reforms and if some solutions are not taken into consideration, it will still become a challenge in the future if we face certain crises. Then we are seeing erosion of multilateral authority. So from this, we are able to note that countries are less willing to follow shared rules and more likely to act on their own interests. So we are able to see countries desire now to act on their own interest instead of following shared rules of multilateral authority. Then another consequence under institutional, we are able to note that there's financing and capacity strain. So we are able to note that global institutions have less money and political support. These in turn limit what they can actually do to solve global issues. So when we go to economic under global still, economic consequences, we are able to see reduced global growth, and these we know we are able to know that the world economy is growing more slowly. We reducing jobs, income, and even opportunities. So there's reduced global growth, and we'll see some example on how this thing happens in reality, or how these consequences are felt in reality. Then we are seeing the weaponization of supply chains. So we see countries use trade and supply chains as political tools. So these in turn disrupt markets and lead to increasing costs. Then there's weaker global public good provision. So we have explained earlier what global public goods are and how essential they are. So we find that essential global public services or public goods like climate protection, financial stability, and health coordination are underprovided. They are not provided in a way that is sufficient for all the globe to benefit. Then when we go to a political aspect of it, still under global, we are able to see one of the greatest consequence of that. We are able to know that there's great power contest. So we find that major powers or major countries, like, just to give an example of US, Russia, China, they are competing. Major countries are powers compete for influence instead of cooperating. So this in turn leads to weakening of global stability. Then there's also rise in radical right-wing governments. So we realize that more governments prioritize nationalism over global cooperation. So these will reduce support for multilateral system, of which that should be essential. Then there's also increased border tension. So when we go to social, we are able to note there's a weakening of global solidarity. So countries and societies are less willing to support each other. So countries try to, or are moving towards independence. They want to support their own, but they don't they are not willing to support each other countries during crisis. Then there's also erosion of global public good. So global public good also comes in the social aspect. So you find people feel the loss of shared benefits like peace. We've seen how peace at some point is deteriorating. So people feel the loss of shared benefits like peace, security, and also environmental protection. Then when we get to the growing generational frustration, so you find young people, because maybe the leaders that we have now, they are not solving the problems that are happening. So young people tend to face few opportunity. They have greater uncertainties of what will happen next, because if things are not solved, the world is leading to more and more fragmentation. So you realize that this leads to a frustration and also delusionment. Then when it comes to now, let us go to the next row. We see the next row shows us the regional consequences. So for the regional consequences, we are able to note that there's increased burden on regional institutions. Like we remember what happened when a global institution withdraws their support. So the burden now goes to the regional institutions like AU. So we find that these institutions are now expected to solve more problems or more crises without enough resources or even authority. Then there's also weak enforcement of regional commitment. So we realize that agreements may exist on paper, but countries often fail to implement or even follow those agreements. Then when it comes to economic, we find there's welfare and also GDP losses. So economic shocks, like when there's a global crisis, when there's fragility, when there's war, we find that these economic shocks tends to reduce incomes at a regional level, and also the living standards. It reduces both the income and the living standards across the region, and we'll be able to see some of them. Then when it comes to market access, so we realize that African countries do face more barriers to trade. Like when there are tariff barriers, so trading between developed and undeveloped countries become difficult. So this limits growth and some opportunities. Then in the long run, it will also lead to widening of inequality. So these gaps will benefit a few, while many communities are still left further behind. Then when it comes to political, so the regional consequences under political, we realize that there'll be rise of militant group. So weak governance and insecurity allow armed groups to gain influence. So we have seen such in, especially when we speak of regional, we are looking at Africa. So when we look at Africa, we have seen such examples in countries like Congo, the rise of this militant group that in turns leads to more insecurity and even wars. Then we see violent election and erosion of democracy. So in our neighboring countries, we have seen violent elections, we have seen erosion of democracy, where political competition increasingly turns into violence, and which in the long run weakens the democratic trust. Then there is a forced unstable alignment. So countries are aligned. You find some people, some countries tend to align with powerful external actors out of maybe necessity, but never at a strategic choice. Then when it comes to the social impact or the social consequences under the regional, so we are able to see there's increased forced migration and displacement. So things like conflict, climate shocks, economic stress, they tend to push people to leave their homes and make them, they are displaced and hence they are refugees in other countries. So it in the long run brings that burden. Then when it comes to local now Kenya or nationally, so under local, we are able to note that under institutions, they are still institutional and governance strain. So public institutions are overstretched by rising demand, but there's limited capacity. So the demand of there's a rising demand, but there's limited capacity because of withdrawal of the financing by the global institutions. Then we have the policy volatility and coordination challenges. So when it comes to policies do change frequently, and we realize that institutions do struggle to work together effectively, and that in turn affect the effectiveness of institutions at a local level. Then when we look at the economic consequences, we are able to know that there'll be or there's trade and investment uncertainties. So there's business delay, investment, because future rules and markets are unclear. Like when the country tend to change trading partners, we don't know what the rules and the regulation the other trading partner will come with. So it makes investment and trading unclear, hence delays growth, and in turn leads to higher cost of living. So prices of food, fuel, and other basic needs do rise faster than people's income because there's no much investment while the cost of living is rising. Then in turn, because we know our country as Kenya, we are more dependent on to finance our deficits, we borrow. So these in turn, when there's that fragmentation, it affects financial institutions that will in turn affect our borrowing cost. And if you look at the statistics, our data shows that over the period of time, we have been borrowing at a high interest rates. So governments and business may end up paying more to borrow. So these end up limiting development spending, because if we are paying more interest to what we borrow, it end up leaving the country with less funds for development spending. Then when it comes to political, we are able to know that there's a rise of factional elites. So political competition, we realize that is driven by an elite group. So this group of people that comes up because of their own interests other than the national priorities, then it in turn leads to religious discontent. So when it comes to religious discontent, you realize that economic and social stress increases religious tension, or some politicians hide in religion to try to influence the society in a way that is not correct. Then lastly, under social, we are able to note there's inequality and social stress. So under this consequence, so as economic pressure deepens, there's that inequality gaps that in the long run strains the social cohesion. Then it also ends up leading to more and more youth unemployment, which we're already experiencing it, but it will lead to more and more youth unemployment. So because many young people cannot find stable work, so this increases frustration and even social risk. So just in summary, to summarize that, so we are able to note that the reason why we classify them under global, regional, and local, so we are able to note that global fragmentation weakens institutions at the top. So that's at the global level. So this in turn comes and strains the economics of in the middle, that is now in the region. And these strains is ultimately felt by people, by you and me, through rising costs. We experience insecurity, and we experience declining opportunity. So that is how they interact. So the global, when there's a problem at the global level, it will affect the middle economies, that is the region. Then it will in turn affect us as a country and locally through those consequences, such as rising cost, insecurity, and declining. Next. So these are just examples of of some of the consequences. So the first image on the left, you are able to see Russia invasion. So we know what has been happening between Russia since 2022 and Ukraine. So we are seeing this is an aerial view of a bombed residential. So we are seeing that these consequences are really felt when such happens. The economy cannot grow as it is expected, and it slows down the economic growth. It leads to destruction of properties that in the long run, even people end up losing their lives and migrating. So these effects are really felt. And when you come to Bangladesh, you are able to note that last year in 2025, there was also there was a problem, an economic problem, a political problem that led to killing of people. Just a minute. That led to killing of people, landmines that left many people disabled. So when people live disabled, they become economically unproductive. So in the long run leads to widening that inequality and also leads to low living standards. Yes, next. Now this is Madagascar. So we are seeing security forces fire rubber bullets at protesters in Madagascar in eruption of violence, leading to civil society alarm. So we realized that let's say 2025, there was attention or protests in Madagascar due to grievances on poor governance and corruption, and also water and power outrage. So someone was saying that imagine a country that is an island that's suffering water shortage. It is ironical. So Madagascar had some issues that lead to economic protest and grievances. Then on this other side, we see Cameroon. So these are regional consequences. We are seeing people are unhappy. The economies are becoming more chaotic. So we see clashes erupt as opposition leaders dispute elections with long awaited official results. So most of these are political as a result of pure bad governance and even lack of better institutions as well. Next. Now this is regionally still and also in Kenya. Even us as a country, we have seen protests that has led to deadly unrest and anger at police brutalities. People are complaining of high living standards, and recently we saw what happened in Tanzania as a result of politics and as a result of poor democracy. So all these consequences in turn affects how the countries operate, and we have seen their origin not only comes from a region, but they comes from the global level that in turns affect the regional, and in the long run, we feel it as a nation and as citizens of our country through high cost of livings and such impacts. So I'll end it at that, and I will welcome Jairus to take us through the next part. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Vivian. So my colleagues have taken you through the global order. We started with Winnie, who took us through, who gave us the context and explained to us what global order is, insisting that it's the outcome of the interactions of actors in the global affairs, and presented to us why it matters, and followed by Emmanuel, who gave us the current status, giving us some indicators across six selected indicators, and sorry, and Vivian has shared the consequences of these interactions, how in either cooperation or fragmentation across 4 pillars: that's institutional, economic, political, and social. And so with this new information that we've got from here, we are asking a question. And in our chat facility up there, you will see a poll, which we want you all to participate kindly. And we are asking the question on a scale of 0 to 10, where 0 is complete fragmentation and 10 is complete cooperation, which is the desired. How would you rate the current state of global order? Again, on a scale of 0 to 10, how would you rate the current state of global order? I hope we can do that quickly in a minute before we sum up this conversation. Justus? So our poll has been posted, and kindly request you to participate. I have some few responses, which I think majority of you think that the rating is 4 out of 10. Thank you, and still I request that you continue to participate, because this will be useful in our follow-up conversation on this. Now, going forward, on the next slide, going forward, continue participating on the next. Now, here we are saying we took the same presentation and data that we've used in this conversation and put through it through AI, and you are able to generate what you're seeing. Now, we used the 4 pillars that Vivian has just communicated to you. That is the political, social, economic, and institutional and aggregate. And from this, the outcome was that it was rating around 3.6. That's the aggregate score for the 4 pillars. That's the state of global order rating at 3.6. And what this means is, as we have indicated, that 10 that will be closer to complete cooperation, which should mean a stable global order, and 1 would mean the opposite. Now 3.6, as you can see, is closer to fragmentation compared to where we desire to be. And actually this matches the outcome of just the poll that we've done. And therefore, it will be important for us to understand how global order affects the society we live in. And if you compared, or if you considered the information that we've just received, especially under the current state, which shows that global order can be, the effects of this can be understood differently according to different levels. And that will lead us to make conclusions. What do we learn from this, or what observations are we getting from here? And therefore, what lessons? Therefore, in our next slide, we are going to further discuss what we just learned today, and what is clear in our understanding of world order or global order. So we are seeing there's still increasing interconnectedness and freedoms. And if you can remember what the second presenter shared, I think still we have our global institutions intact. We have, I think there hasn't been much withdrawal from most of those global institutions like the UN. At the level, we've had more countries signing into the free trade, the Continental Free Trade Area agreements. And also, we've seen from the same presentation, we've been able to see that we still have global powers participating in international trade. And actually, Manuel raised a concern on Africa being a big continent, large continent, large population, but not actively participating in global trade. However, still we have that interconnectedness. What was clear also was the rising geopolitical rivalry. The most obvious one being US and China tensions, and then the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which still continues, and which should worry us, because, as we'll state further, the consequences, or what happens, the global order has spillover effects, which could be positive or negative, and therefore geopolitical rivalry is something we need to be concerned of. As we would desire more cooperation, we've seen politics even in Europe turning to nationalist and inward-looking policies, which tend to pull towards fragmentation, and then declining trust in multilateral institutions, as has been explained, which therefore affects efficiency in delivery of global public goods. And then finally, also, we've had increasing frequency in global shocks, and pandemics is just something we experienced a few years ago, and still we're recovering from that. And that's important because pandemic control is a public good, as explained here. And therefore, when we have fragmentation, therefore it becomes difficult to have coordinated efforts towards pandemic control and management of global climate. And also, we've had more conversation about dates in the United States, in African states, and here at home. In our next conversation, within the week, we'll be sharing the status of our date again and why it matters. In our next slide, here now we want to reiterate that global fragmentation is structural. And therefore, resolving some of these challenges that we've stated here will require more investments in global institutions and just making them more efficient in responding to global challenges. We've also explained that global order is shaped from local, regional, and global factors. And this is clear because global order is not just affected by what the big powers be. It's not just about the behavior of the big powers. It starts at the local level, and that will touch on the level of government efficiency, which can influence the outcome of economic growth and stability. In the regional level, we've been able to observe that Central Africa region and mostly Africa, almost as a whole region, has weak institutions which can be measured through those indices that we've shared around here. And at a global level, the behavior of the major players and how that has continued to shape the global order. And therefore, we cannot ignore what happens in individual countries because they are far from us, because the next point reminds us that global order has spillover effects. When maritime security and stability begins in one country, it is possible that we'll be able to experience these spillover effects. On the positive side, when we have a stronger maritime security, that means supply of goods and access to markets will be possible for countries, and therefore we'll have the benefits of trade. Financial stability, again, the same. And therefore, the most important thing that we can take from this conversation is that there is high correlation between prosperity, freedoms, stability, and peace. And if you can remember the maps, the global maps that we shared on state fragility, on individual freedoms, and the poverty, you'd be able to correlate, you'll be able to see that places where we have more freedoms, individuals enjoy more freedoms, and state fragility is low, meaning that we have very stable governments, those countries enjoy more prosperity. And therefore, this debunks the desire by a few of us, depending on the information you consume, that we need dictators to be able to have working economies and stable countries. The data shows that that's not true. And therefore, even as individuals, communities, organizations, and institutions, it will be desirable to put our efforts to support or to encourage greater investments in freedoms and governments that are stable. And therefore, that will be able to lead to more prosperity, which will also mean that as global order will be able to improve. This is not our last. So we've been able to explain what global order means. We've been able to provide the states of the global order and the consequences and conclusion to that. But this is not where we're going to stop with this work. In our next webinar in a few weeks to come, we'll be able to advance this conversation and asking, therefore, from these observations, from these findings, what needs to be fixed and where. And therefore, that will also be followed by a brief, and I hope we'll continue to enrich this conversation. Thank you. Back to you, Winnie.
Thank you, Jairus, Vivian, and Emmanuel, for taking us through the current state of global order, looking at examples from prosperity, freedom, stability, and peace, and the consequences. And the one thing that is very clear is that the ideal global order cannot be achieved if we ignore or do away with the interconnectedness of countries. And when you're speaking about the global order, which Jairus has mentioned, we are not just speaking about the superpowers, what happens with what the superpowers do. In reality, it is actually a collective of what every country does. So we want, when people are having conversations of global order influx, a lot of times you will hear the US has done this, the US has done this. So we want, as we are having this conversation, to move us away from having conversations specifically around the US, but expanding our minds to the reality that the global order goes beyond what the US does, as much as it has great impact and influence. There are other players who are part of the globe whose what they do has a ripple effect. And as Vivian was giving the examples, probably some of us are wondering why we're speaking global order and the examples we are giving us specifically around conflict. Just a disclaimer, those are examples we have chosen as the Institute of Economic Affairs to show that the global order is actually in flux. But if you look at conflict is just one pointer to a global order that is in flux. But if you look at the reasons for the conflict, you'll find reasons such as, you'll find political reasons, you'll find economic reasons, you'll find social reasons, all of which are also pointers, but the greater end is usually conflict, and so we are using that, but there are other examples beyond conflict. And then just of the examples that we've also seen from Vivian and Emmanuel, we think, or we are confident that you can now have make a decision, and clearly from the poll that we shared, come to a conclusion that the global order is actually in flux. And as much as it is not collapsing, the globe is not collapsing, but we are moving more towards fragmentation as opposed to coordination and collaboration. And why is this so? If you look at the indices that Emmanuel has shared, for example, you notice that in as much as, for example, in peace, in as much as we are making progress towards positive peace, there's more going towards negative peace, and that's a pointer. Coordination is sort of taking place. People are doing better to have the ideal global order, but the push is more towards a fragmented order. So, and just to take us back to the reality that when you're having, as much as we are seeing a global order that is in flux, at the end of it, the ripple effects brings us to having a conversation around a regional order that is in flux and a local order that is in flux as a consequence of political changes, institutional changes, social changes, and economic changes that are taking place. Because as we had explained when we were introducing global order, we had told you that a global order is an outcome. And what an outcome of what? It is an outcome of a change that is taking place. And these changes, as I have mentioned, could be political, social, economic, or even institutional, as Vivian mentioned with what we experienced when one institutional when one institution withdrew funding, we saw what happened. Now we are having the US withdrawing from the UN Habitat. We clearly need to be alert to the consequences of that withdrawal, which will not only be global, but at the regional level, we are going to feel an impact. There's going to be an implication. And even at the local level, there are going to be consequences of that withdrawal. So in a nutshell, that was what our conversation was about today. And now we want to open up to the Q&A session. So you can give us your comments and your questions, if any. And then my colleagues will be able to respond. So if you feel you have a question, this is your time to use the toolbar, raise your hand, we will be able to see it, and we'll pick you and you'll unmute yourself and ask your question. Please, as you'll be unmuting yourself, kindly ensure you're in a quiet place where we will not have interference from your background. So without much ado, Diana, please unmute yourself and ask your question. And as Diana is asking her question, if you feel you can't voice it, you want to type it in, please feel free to do that. So Diana, please go ahead.
Thank you very much. This has been a very insightful webinar. I just have a question, sort of a comment following from what Emmanuel presented. And Emmanuel, the first question would be, where do you see Africa in this global order? Are there any opportunities for Africa? But then also something I wanted to raise from your point in terms of responding to shocks is that the global order is also a rules-based system. And we know that the rules are not working for most of the countries in Africa. The rules that are being set either at the trade level, debt level, the global economic rules, they are set by these developed countries, and they don't favor developing countries. So the global order cannot be fair in any way. And therefore, I think one of the things that is emerging is the need to reform how the rules have been done for a long time. And the best example of this is the UN Tax Convention and other processes that are happening at the international level to actually challenge the rules-based system of the global order. Thank you.
Anyone else with a question before we ask Emmanuel to respond? Okay, so Emmanuel, if you could have a go at the question by Diana.
Thanks. Thanks, Diana. So Diana asked, okay, where do we see Africa? I think first we can take account of the continent's capacities together institutionally, right? Because that helps us to determine where it's going to be at. So if you just look at our share of global GDP, if Africa is around what, just under 3 trillion or 2 trillion, the world GDP is about 100 trillion, right? Dollars. That's the size of the world economy. So effectively, the continent as a whole is a price taker. Now we disaggregate this again regionally. The East African community, about 0.23% of global trade, just global trade on the export side. We just make up 0.23% of global exports, right? But if we look around us, there's we can see how much we benefit from importing from the world, for being plugged into global markets. So because we're price takers, we actually benefit from stability. So it's beneficial for African countries to look for that stability. Now, I think it's fair to ask ourselves why we failed to do that, why, even after the Cold War ended, we still 30 years later, right? I mean, look, one of the things with multipolarity is that it's not something, it's not a mysterious event. It's something that you could see the possibility of even 30 years ago. And it's one of those things where the African continent, you know, countries at the country level could have been better prepared by just being wealthier and having better institutions. We could have, if we had the quality of institutions like Korea does, South Korea does, for example, right now, right? Since it's geographically, it's a small country, but economically it's very big. Poland, which is a country that we shared the same institutional dysfunction after the Cold War. So in 1990, in the year 1990, Kenya's per capita is actually ahead of China's. And Kenya is probably, you know, it's probably some give and take, but Kenya is just as corrupt. Kenyan's institutions are just as dysfunctional as those of Poland. And Poland is also coming out of its experience with the Soviet Union, an experience similar probably in a lot of ways to what Kenyans experienced under the authoritarian regime of the time, right? So with all its, you know, its attendant social outcomes, you know, the psychological, everything, they figured it out and they reformed, and they built better institutions. They plugged into the European Union. They became wealthy, and they are now currently, when you talk about conflict, they are one of the stalwarts for the European Union. They have the largest number of tanks in the European Union. So the question for African countries is why, on the one hand, why they failed to build strong institutions in that period, and whether they can at least start now. And some of it is trying to figure out why the Kenyan and African publics have not been able to raise the cost of misbehavior for their legislators, because you have better, if you have better representatives who are kept in line by the public, because that's a public's job, then that, you know, on the whole translates to better institutions that can respond to global events. So that's another way of saying that we might be looking at a very, let's say in extreme cases, right? In extreme cases where powers are want you to do what is in their favor and are going outside the global, the multilateral system to extract concessions from small countries. Those small countries that have weak institutions are going to be least able to respond. So, for example, you know, you're a country and, you know, let's say a middle power from the Middle East buys up your representatives. It's effectively destroying even those weak institutions you have. They're being cut up. So, you know, they're being predated upon. And the result is, you know, you can look at the Cold War history to sort of stimulate your imagination as to what could happen. We look at Sudan being torn apart by foreign powers, conflict in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. So then I'll end that by saying, yes, you know, the need to reform the rules. The rules are set and don't favor developing countries. So one of the functions of good institutions is, instead of relying, for example, on one's and here I'm responding to some of the political commentary that we have, which is a lot of conspiracy theories. When you have strong institutions, then they can specialize in actually going out there and saying, okay, what's the state of some of these rules? Where are they unfair? And then can we have a sustained campaign to make them fair? Because what we see is that African governments they're not even there in the rhetoric, in the battlefield of debates, let alone you know, before we even speak of changing something from unfair to fair, if you don't even see a sustained effort, you know, to engage this intellectually at the state at the state level in order to reform these rules. So we need, African countries, final comment, you see the comments by leaders like Alexander Stubb of Finland, right? The Nordic countries, especially as Finland, you saw the comments by the Prime Minister of Canada yesterday evening, responding to saying that for those who feel that, for example, there's events that make you feel cynical about the fairness of the rules-based order. And people say, man, rules-based, and do air quotes and sort of scoff at it, and Prime Minister Mark Carney actually responded to that, said, maybe middle powers should have been pointing to those inconsistencies and saying that, okay, this isn't fair and it's not in line with a rules-based order. So he made the illustration saying, in the same way that you have what allows authoritarianism to persist at the domestic level. Everyone just pretends that everything is okay and doesn't say anything when people get abducted or when all sorts of injustices are inflicted, right? Everyone keeps going, especially those, in a state, it could be the elites, very educated, wealthy, driving nice cars, but never say anything when things happen and pretend, right? Pretend that, yeah, Kenya is progressing, it's going somewhere, and never say anything until, one day the whole thing collapses, right? And that's what happened with authoritarian regimes, say in the Soviet Union. And then he points out and says, this is what can happen or maybe has happened at the global level. So you should watch his speech. He does a very balanced overview of the state of affairs and says, look, middle powers need to do something, which is a good thing. And in the same way, African countries have to show some leadership, get your affairs in order, and at the same time going out there and saying, this is the world we want. I don't have all the guns to force everyone to do what I want them to do, but this is the world I want. Thank you.
Thanks, Manny, for your response. We hope, Diana, you are satisfied by that response. So we have two other questions on the chat. So James from TI is asking, the presentation captured that military expenditure is a sign of negative peace. How about expenditure to purchase new armor? Is this still a sign of negative peace? However, that military budget is often partially confidential or opaque in the guise of national security as justification. And then Kwame is asking, based off the score, so can we have an explanation of the score on the state of global order that appeared in the later slides? It came as an aggregate of 3.65 out of 10, and he considers this a low score. So the question is, do the presenters think this AI-generated metric is a fair score? So I will start with Vivian. You can answer to either or. Vivian.
Okay, thank you, Winnie. I think I can answer to the last question. About the AI simulation, showing the score as at 3.65. So I think this is a fair score because as we have seen through our data, and it is almost similar to what our thoughts are when we did the analysis, because many people are saying we are at 4. So I think this is a fair score because when you look at some of the factors that leads to fragmentation, we are losing more peace. The countries are becoming more fragile, and this score tells us something that we are much closer to fragmentation as we are to to cooperation. So I think this score is fair based on the results or the realities we have seen and their consequences. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, and just also to add to that, remember the score is of data that we fed to the AI. So it used the data and the scores that were already existing for some of them to now do an aggregate. In as much as we gave our own scaling of 1 to 10, probably if we gave it a wider scaling of 1 to 100, then probably we'd be seeing similar scores of for the average global, for example, for all those indicators that we use. So it's probably something that we need to try just to affirm that this score is actually fair, to run the scores that were given for the global average and with a wider score of maybe 1 to 100 and see if the AI score is actually closer or farther to the average score. So as somebody who was also part of doing the AI scoring and feeding it, I think it was a fair score. Jairus?
Thank you. I think the question on whether the score is fair, I think has been answered. We think so. And again, it agrees with what participants think. And again, it's based on the data that we shared. Okay, on the political, I think of the 4 pillars, I think the political pillar had the highest score, slightly higher at 3.8. And I think that can be explained that we have at least more countries participating, holding elections. But again, I think what waters that down now is how the elections are held. We've had violent elections across different parts of Africa. Our neighbors just did an election the other day, and we saw same thing that happened in Tanzania, where internet was shut down during elections. And in the Central and West Africa part of Africa, you see that we have coups are back. We have attempted coups this year. I think 2 were successful, and countries that went back into dictatorship rules 3 years ago are still under military rule. Before I give the mic, I was thinking of this question by Diana, and you say that global order is rule-based, and that's true, we agree. And thank you for that idea on the UN tax. We'll look at that because our intention is that a follow-up conversation on this will actually look at what's not working in this global order and what can be fixed. And that will be an important point to consider. And lastly, on the same issue of rules-based, I think states, interaction of states or participation of states is mostly guided by rules. It's true that global powers dominate in setting of these rules, and then they're biased towards them or against the small powers. And on this, I think we'll examine what goes into that and be able to comment on that strongly in our next in our brief that will come following this. And then you asked about opportunities for Africa. Emmanuel has responded to that, but I want to add 2. At the local level, our strong recommendation is that we need to have expanded individual freedoms. And at the regional level, we strongly recommend that there's need to have more cooperation on the continental level, especially in trade. So when countries try to go towards protectionist policies, I think that one should worry us, and therefore, as small economies, I think it will be wiser if we focus more on greater integration into the world economy and therefore opening up our economies. I think that will be one opportunity for Africa. Okay, thank you.
All right, Emmanuel.
Thanks, Winnie. Yeah, small open economies actually, we should just pursue a policy of unilateral free trade, right? So that's saying that don't wait to do 100 negotiations with 100 countries for trade. Just say, you know what, or organize your safeguards as a country, and then go out there and tell everyone who wants to import to Kenya export to Kenya, they can. This is the policy of both Hong Kong and Singapore, right? And the latter of which is a very popular name in our streets nowadays. And so do the presenters think that this AI generated metric is a fair score? Yeah, recently we saw that the United States that contributes 30% of UN funding actually withdrew. So if you assume that this 30% of their contributions, let's say even 20% went away. I think China's as the next largest one. I think they have to. UN rules, right? As per UN rules, you have to make a contribution of about 12%, if I remember correctly. So if when you see an event like that, and the sort of very hot debates around the world, I think it's fair to say that it's true that this score is fair. And then we had a question from a colleague, a friend here from the TI. So, how is military expenditure a sign of negative peace? So militarization beyond what is sufficient for defense it elicits a response, right? And military aggrandizement elicits aggrandizement. So this, I think, is the reason why it counts as an indicator of deteriorating peace. And of course, the determination of what is sufficient for defense and what is in excess, we can leave to the military planners. But the fact that every time before a country engages in conflict, whether it is authoritarian or democratic, they actually have to take time to convince people that this is a worthy pursuit. And so you'll see rhetoric shifting and things like that, and populations being readied for action. So if you see Ethiopia purchasing those new platforms, their Sukhoi 37s, first we can assume they're not being purchased for picnics. But then when you see again and again the government showing maps of Ethiopia reunited with Eritrea, then you can connect the two. And even as a civilian, we can say, okay, that looks like the purchase of weapons is contributing to negative peace. So, when you talk about budgets being partly confidential or opaque, so wealthy, freer countries, first of all, the budget allocation in total is known, and it's known to great detail. And it's the only very specific cases where the detail is secret. But when you see that NATO is saying, look, we need to raise our expenditures, and this is a public conversation because it's a democratic country, that's an increase in expenditure. So we can ignore, countries with their fake national security justifications and their budgets where they're actually just stealing funds, and those countries are usually small and poor anyway. So on the globe, when we're looking at it globally, we can ignore them and say the wealthier countries are spending more, the wealthier democratic ones, and then they are saying that the wealthy other unfree ones are also spending more. So there you go.
All right, thank you, Mani. Thank you, Jairus, Vivian, for your response. I don't know if my colleague Moses has anything to add to those questions, but in the meantime, as he prepares, if at all he has, if anybody else has a question, please raise your hand, use the bar, raise your hand, and you will have an opportunity because there are no further questions on the chat box or on the Q&A. So anyone else with a question or a comment? Okay, so clearly there are no further questions. So I'll give my colleagues an opportunity to give their final remarks as far as the Global Order 2026 is concerned, and also just as a closing, as we end this webinar. So I will start with Jairus. Jairus?
Okay, thank you. Thank you everyone for being part of this conversation and for your engagements. We are glad, and this will be very important to us in again the conversation that we've indicated. Just to remind us that as we have argued, global order cannot be looked at just what the major power, the major power in the world does, the behavior of the major power, but we can look at it from local level, what's happening in individual countries, on human rights, on stability and efficiency of governments, at regional level, what's happening within different regions at a global level. And therefore, we should not restrict ourselves at just looking at what are the behaviors of the global powers. And lastly, we've argued that global order has spillover effects, and therefore we need to be able to understand that global order is actually desirable for individuals, firms, states, and all actors in the global system. Thank you.
Emmanuel?
Thanks. Thank you so much. Thanks for joining, and thank you to our colleagues and even those who you might not see, Kwame and Michelle and Justice for helping us. And my final comment would be that we need more actually grown-up responsibility on. We've always needed it here domestically, and we also need it at the regional and the global level to counter there's a lot of nitwittery, a lot of this idea that it's cynicism, right? We need to counter the cynicism with well thought out and practical and idealistic courage. So at the domestic level, we need more engagement with our public institutions, because that's at least one important vector through which they are improved. We need to stand up to the authoritarianism in the region. This kind of it's just pure deception and bullying, right? And it's hard, but I mean, there's many examples that we can draw from and sort of actually have the big picture in mind, that freer societies are more prosperous. Strong institutions that are designed to preserve these freedoms are desirable, and that peace requires more than wearing berets and walking around with pistols in exposed holsters. Real life is not an action movie. And finally, at the global level, we need that same kind of grown-up, determined idealism to counter the sort of the bro politics that we are seeing, that is sort of carrying the day, and the idea that we can't we can't be sophisticated and courageous at the same time. Thank you.
Vivian?
Okay. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining. And just to add more to what my colleagues have said, so we have seen that the central global fragmentation is not basically conflict between states, though that is part of it, but is not wholly that. But it is through the quiet erosion of systems that makes cooperation, growth, social stability possible. So when these systems weakens, because it is these systems that come up with rules. So when this system weakens, crises multiply faster than institutions can respond. Then just finally, so we've seen how it works through from global all the way to the local level. So we have understood that global fragmentation weakens the rules at the top. So once that is weakened, this spreads instability in the middle, which is the region. Then it leaves households, farms and governments and young people paying the price at the bottom. So we are able to see that coordination. So when it weakens at the top, then it spreads in the middle through instability. Then it leaves households, farms, and government paying the prices at the bottom. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, so thank you so much to my colleagues, Emmanuel, Vivian, and Jairus, and of course, Moses, who was part of the team that was preparing this presentation, for the amazing presentation that you have done. And I mean, of the conversation you have had briefly, it has clearly been insightful. And the one thing that is very... Sorry. And the one thing that is clear is that the global order is not static. So the globe will continue to experience change, whether it will be political, social, institutional, or economic, we do not know. But that change is prone to happen. And when that change happens, we cannot leave it as a them problem, leaving it to wherever the change is happening. But we have to sit back and ask ourselves what the implication, what the ripple effect of that change will be. And that is why our conversation was not just limited to the global implications of change, but rather to whatever change at whatever level would mean globally, regionally, and locally. So at the end of the day, change will happen. How we will prepare for that change how we prepare for that change will be dependent on how interconnected we choose to be as countries. So our choice is to move towards more coordination as opposed to more fragmentation. But again, it is how we will relate that we will determine which direction we move. So we want to appreciate all of us for making time to be part of this conversation today. And even as we come to an end, we want to remind you that the Institute of Economic Affairs is a membership organization. And if you wish to join us as members, please feel free to reach out to our communications team, Michelle and Oscar, and they will be very glad to take you through the joining process, and you will enjoy the perks of being a member. That said, please be on the lookout on our social media pages. We have 2 other webinars lined up for tomorrow and Friday. If you are very interested in understanding debt and just what Kenya should actually be aiming for as far as that is concerned, please join us tomorrow at 11 a.m. as we will be having that conversation. And on Friday, if you're concerned about our education system, our education sector, please join us as we will be having another conversation on the education sector. That said, thank you so much and do have a beautiful, lovely afternoon. Asanteni.